I want to introduce our roundtable, and I'm very, very excited about it. I'm going to let our moderator, Carol Bruckner, give you the background and kind of some, tell you about what it's really all about. So I'm just going to give you the soundbite and why I think this is a super important issue. So to me, when you look at other countries, some of them use disaggregated data like by gender and how tax policies affect, gender, right? We don't look at how tax policies affect people by gender, by race, by ethnicity. And gee, it's like some countries can score by that, but we don't even collect the data right to know how to use it. And so to me, that's the kind of 1-minute version. And Carol, I know will come and correct me about what it's really about. But I'm going to have everybody come up. Yeah.
Hi, Mark. Mark, can I get you to sit over there? Yep. Steven, right there?
Yep.
Danny, good to meet you.
Hey there.
Thanks so much for doing this. Thanks.
All right, so this is our panel, and as you can see, each and every one of them is a distinguished person. So I'm going to go first. Well, I'm actually going to go by alphabetical order. So first, our moderator, Caroline Bruckner, is the senior professorial lecturer and managing director of the Kogod Tax Policy Center at American University and the School of Business there. Thanks, Caroline. And then to her left, my left, I always have trouble with that, is Steve Dean. And Steve Dean's professor of law, co-director of the Dennis J. Block Center for the Study of International Business Law at the Brooklyn Law School, and he's also on our Diversity in the Professions Committee, which we really appreciate. To my left, right here, to his right, Mark Mazur, former Assistant Secretary for Tax Policy at the U.S. Department of the Treasury, and so much more, co-director of the, or actually director, I guess, of the Tax Policy Center, many, many things. And then to the far left, Danny Yegan, I hope I'm saying that right, good, Chief Economist at the Office of Management and Budget. And when I was looking him up to find his email address, I saw many, many amazing quotes and things about him. So I'm very excited about hearing from everybody. So now I will just say thanks to the American Tax Policy Institute who helped organize this panel, and with that, I'm going to turn it over so we can actually get to the good stuff.
All right, great. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for sticking around for this last but incredibly important conversation that is going to impact tax policy and how we see it moving forward in a post-pandemic code. The reason that we're here today is because of a lot of people like Dorothy Brown, like Steve Dean, like Jeremy Barra-Friend, who have worked tirelessly for decades to really illustrate what is going on in the tax code in terms of race and gender, and how our tax code and tax administration system impacts people differently on the basis of race, gender, and ethnicity. Academics have really led the way, and our tax code, as all of you tax lawyers know in this room, we are not required to report any racial or ethnic information on our Form 1040s, although there are ways that you can extrapolate that, as you heard in the diversity luncheon yesterday. But we generally don't collect or disseminate how our tax expenditures or how our tax system is administered differently on the basis of race, gender, or ethnicity. At the same time, there are very clear provisions and expenditures in the tax code that are administered on the basis of ethnicity at least. There are specific provisions targeted specifically to Native Americans. And what has happened in recent years is that academics have finally been able to break through into a general discourse. People like Dorothy Brown, who are on The View. I can tell you as a tax professor, there is one time a year I get a call from the media and it's April 15th. That's all the time the media has for tax stories generally. And when you have a tax professor on Good Morning America or on The View explaining the disparate impacts of our tax system on the basis of race or gender, that's millions of people outside of the tax bar, outside of the tax experts in this room, that are starting to see the way the tax system impacts them differently. And why does that matter? Because policymakers are paying attention. And we saw this on day one of the Biden administration when he signed an executive order establishing an interagency task force to look at racial and gender inequities across federal programs, and for the first time, including tax data. Specifically, he established an Equitable Data tax group, and we are lucky enough to have the guy that's running it sitting over there. Danny Hagan, who is a brilliant professor when he's not serving his country as chief economist from OMB at Berkeley. He has his PhD and undergrad degrees from Harvard, and it has a distinguished, incredible resume, but he has chosen to spend Saturday with us away from his infant who is sick to explain and give us an update on what's going on with the tax data provisions of the Interagency Working Group. Lily actually had put out a statement about the latest status progress update in December, I believe it was, but we're here to get actual, hopefully more current information from Danny. In addition, we are lucky enough to hear from Stephen Dean, who has spent his career working on these issues both on a federal and international level. As Julie pointed out, there's a lot of stuff that's going on in other countries and in other tax systems from which we can model. The US is actually behind on some of these issues relative to other countries. And then to drill down as to why there has been so much only intermittent acknowledgement or research on these issues, we've got Mark Major, who has worked in virtually every capacity at JCT, at the Council of Economic Advisors, and whatnot, to really kind of paint a broader picture of institutional barriers. But to kick things off, I thought I would put Danny on the hot seat and ask him to give us the latest on the Interagency Working Group, and maybe walk us through what the mandate is, and what progress you're making, and next steps.
Thank you so much. Delighted to be here, and thank you for the introduction and for setting the table here. Yes, let me walk you through the course of the last 15 years, how we got here, and then hopefully where we want to be through this task force. So I'll tell it through the lens of my own work. Graduate student, finishing graduate school around 2011. I was part of the charter group of external researchers who, thanks to people like Mark, could team up with researchers at IRS and Treasury to do tax policy and administration research as provided by statute. Think education tax subsidies, think business tax formation, preferences, and the like, think income distribution. And when you do that research, you can cut the data by certain demographics that are present in the tax data. Data that are either collected straight from taxpayers or transferred from other parts of the government because they're needed for tax administration. So think date of birth, so you can get age, think sex, think citizenship, things that directly impact tax administration. So I'm sitting there at the computer, and I want to cut the data by race. That's the natural other demographic that you'd want to cut the data by to understand are certain tax preferences being disproportionately benefiting one group or another, and you can't do it. Race data and ethnicity data live in three parts of government with differing levels of comprehensiveness: the Census Bureau, the Social Security Administration, and in birth records, but not in tax data. And so 2011 hit the wall, can't do it. Fast forward 5 years later, and two researchers at the Census Bureau, Sonia Porter and Maggie Jones, pioneer research that link race and ethnicity data at the Census Bureau to the tax records that under statute are regularly transmitted from Treasury to Census for Census's bread and butter work of economic measurement. Under statute, they can team up with external researchers as well to conduct inequity and equity research. And so 5 years later, there's progress. But there's a problem. One, there's only certain types of data that make their way over to Census. Two, the greatest tax economist and lawyer group in government lives at Treasury, and they don't have access to these data. So all the publications that we're used to can't influence those. And third, you don't have real-time data that can be nimble. So think of the CARES Act payments, think of the child tax credit. That's all new. That's not part of the regular transmission of data to the Census Bureau, so you're out of luck. And Treasury is actually just at the leading edge of a more general problem in measuring equities and inequities in government outlays and receipts. HUD, the Housing and Urban Development Department, they want to measure how housing vouchers are being taken up across race and ethnicity. Are all the people eligible taking it up? How does that vary by race and ethnicity? Can't do it unless they transfer the data to Census or otherwise have a way to impute or infer race and ethnicity in their own data. So now fast forward to 2021. As we just heard, President Biden signs first day racial equity executive order charging his administration to figure out how to do this. Congress has statutes that permit data transfers and merges for economic measurement, for tax policy administration, for the measurement of how government is doing its business. Can we make this happen? And so sitting at OMB as its chief economist and as one of the co-heads, OMB co-leads this with the Office of Science and Technology Policy, the Equitable Data Working Group, Mark and I, along with others at Treasury, IRS, Census, Council of Economic Advisors, took this charge very seriously. In the next 5 years, we want to have a different world where we can really measure how government outlays and receipts vary by race and ethnicity. So what did we do? Well, we took 3 areas, and I'm going to focus on the one that Lily gave us an update on in December, and we can give a continued update here. But there are 3 prongs. The first is, what data can be merged? So I mentioned that, Census, we've had data merges there. Are there other possible data merges that can be done? Okay, that's one. Second, what can be imputed or inferred? So those statistics of income public use files, is there a way to actually have a safe and secure imputed race and ethnicity variable such that everyone in this room can conduct race and ethnicity analyses using those public use files? Can we have a way that there's just more general usage of these data? The third is drilling down on the new data, regular data, how is government doing its business? We took as our charge a case study, the economic impact payments under the CARES Act. What equities or inequities by race and ethnicity were there in the speed by which those payments reached households and whether households received those payments at all? Why is that an interesting and important question? The way that Treasury and IRS were able to get checks to people immediately was whether you filed a tax return. They have your bank account on file, can just transfer the data immediately. And heroically, they could actually do this. Within a week, dollars went out the door. But if you don't file your taxes, income low enough, think elderly, think lower income Americans, and if you don't have access or otherwise able to file actively telling the IRS, I'm eligible, send me a check, you may not get your check and you may not get it quickly even if you do get it. So working within the statutes and the building on previous work, we have now signed a contract between IRS and Treasury and Census for a new data transfer to be merged with race and tax with race data at Census to produce tables by race and ethnicity and sex and age and income levels for transfer back to Treasury and IRS in aggregated form, subject to privacy concerns, and then being released to the public by Treasury in a new report. And I'm happy to say that since December, the data transfer has been made, analyses are ongoing, and I'm very eager and looking forward to this report coming out, and that this can serve as paving a road so that the next analysis, think the child tax credit that just expired, that can be done similarly. And then HUD can learn from Treasury's process and do this themselves. And then finally, sitting at OMB, thinking about the fiscal 23 budget that we released last month, we have in there a request for additional funding to support exactly these types of efforts. And our hope is that with all of us in this room and outside, banging the table saying this is really important, that we can really beef up these analyses so that in 5 years from now, we're all sitting back here saying, wow, isn't it amazing how far we've come? Thanks.
Thanks for the update. I appreciate that. Do we have a date on that report?
I don't have a date on the report.
Okay, I'll follow up. So that's part of the story. The data piece and the transfer of data between Census and IRS, definitely part of the story, but there is a much larger contextual part of the story in terms of whether or not the IRS or Treasury has the authority or the obligation to do the kind of racial or gender analysis that we're talking about that we could do with this data. And I wanted to pivot to Stephen Dean to kind of center us and contextualize this larger question about how we can look at this from what is the legal basis and what is that contextual story that we should know from a legal perspective rather than just a data perspective.
Sure. Thanks so much, and thanks. Great to be here. Thank you, Caroline, for bringing us together. Thanks to the section for hosting this. Is really important, and I'm glad to see so many faces out there to have this conversation. I feel like I owe you an explanation for why I'm sitting here in a t-shirt, and it is an interesting story. And I have to disagree with one thing Caroline said. I definitely have not spent my entire career working on this, and I'll explain how I got here. So I'm wearing this great t-shirt that's tax justice is racial justice,
Okay.
which it's seemed the perfect moment to wear this t-shirt, so here I am. So just a brief anecdote, I swear it'll be brief. So about 5 years ago, I was happily being vice dean at Brooklyn Law School, where I've been since 2004. Having a great time. I just published a new textbook on corporate tax, which I love. And those of you who know me know I really think that's the super fun thing to do. And I got a call from David Kamen and Noel Cunningham. They said, hey, we need somebody to help run our graduate tax program. I said, no, go away. I'm not doing that. That sounds terrible. They are pretty persuasive. So I ended up doing that. And one of the reasons that I wanted to do it was, I'd had a lot of opportunities to do great things. I've been on the executive committee of the New York State Bar Association tax section for a while, and that's really been exciting to hang out with a lot of my very nerdy heroes and work on important topics. But I thought I could do some good by leading this program. And there were some things that we did that were really easy. So with the help of one of the adjuncts, Jeff Friedman at Eversheds Sutherland, we created the first scholarship for underrepresented groups in the graduate tax program. Everybody loved that. It was great. That was easy. There were some things that were harder. So there's a great program that a lot of people in this room have been products of, who are now full-time tenured faculty members throughout the US. We renamed that so it didn't have the awkward name it used to have. We had an Asian guy, a black woman, and an Hispanic guy who are all now tenure-track faculty members at US law schools just in a handful of years. So that was all, it was great, everybody loved it, it's super awesome. But there were some things that were much harder, and some things that a conversation or an idea just couldn't fix. And I am not by nature an outspoken guy, but those experiences made me realize, and I've had the great fortune to be friends with Dorothy Brown, and I've heard her struggles in trying to, she's been writing about this for decades. I have not been. She's been literally writing about this for decades. And I encourage you to go and take a look at an article she wrote in the Pittsburgh Tax Review, Tales from a Tax Crit. If you want to understand why Danny couldn't do what he wanted to do in 2011, the response she got from trying to get this done 20 years ago, you'll understand. Seriously, download it. It'll send those chills up your spine that we heard about earlier from Karen, but a different context. So while all this is going on, just to, okay, this is a longer anecdote than I meant. But
it's really interesting.
Well, but here, so this is all part of how I ended up here in a t-shirt instead of a student tie, which you all probably, those of you who remember me at all, would remember me like that. So around this time when I was at NYU, I also had joined the board of New York City Audubon. My 13-year-old son is an avid birder. He has been since almost before he could walk, which is weird, but it's true. And so this is going on, and one of the other board members was Christian Cooper. So one of my son's favorite place to look for birds in the world was the exact spot where Christian Cooper, if he wasn't so mature and smart, could have ended up dead. This is where my 13-year-old son, who is black, you won't be surprised to hear, loves to go birding. And while all this was happening, I realizing that I needed to not just rely on my relationships with people who had power, but I had to really be outspoken, I realized how urgent it was. And I really don't know birds at all. So that is an area where I can help. But I know tax, and I know a lot of tax people. So I wrote, and I keep writing about this issue. I wrote a few weeks ago, thanks to Christine Kim, I wrote a piece in the Utah Law Review, she's right here, Filing While Black, about this perspective. And just to make sure that everybody saw it, I wrote a letter to the editor to Tax Notes. And the reason I knew that was published, I got an early email, and I didn't quite know what it was, but it was actually a racist hate email from an avid reader of Tax Notes telling me how my letter was disgusting. So all of this makes me realize that this is incredibly urgent. I have the privilege of tenure, so I don't really care who gets mad at me. I don't like getting racist emails early in the morning, but I'll take it. I hope I don't get any more from this, but I can take it. It's fine. But what I want to say is that this is really, to me, an urgent personal priority. Folks like Dorothy Brown should be here, but she's on The View, so she's not here. So I'll be here, and I'll try to make the case. I told her about the email. She's like, "That's your first one? Come on, you're not trying hard enough." She's gotten many, but this is really urgently important, and the work that you're doing, the work that Mark is going to be able to help us do, and that you're talking about, is just incredibly important. I want to tell one more thing. So why is it so important? So there was, in 2006, a prior recipient of the Distinguished Service Award, somebody you may have heard of, Marty Ginsburg. Anybody heard of this guy? So famously, he and his wife really did this already in the gender space, right? So the very famous case, Moritz versus Commissioner, right? This was about gender equity, and this was the beginning of an incredibly important chapter in American legal history. It was about, should there be gender equity? Can there be gender discrimination in the tax code? And you wouldn't really believe that they would need to do this. You would need Bernie Ginsburg and Ruth Bader Ginsburg to tell us that we needed to do this, but we did. And they fought it successfully all the way up the food chain, and they won. And this was one of the first examples of understanding that this matters in the tax code. It matters, and it was not thought to matter before they made us understand that it matters. So, I'm here to, wear crazy T-shirts, write outspoken letters to the editor in Tax Notes, and just to really sound the alarm. If you look at my career, I spent the first, 15 years of it, writing, incredibly nerdy stuff with silly titles, because I'm that way. But it was not about this. And it's really only been the last few years that made me realize that I have the privilege to do this and to really try to get everybody to understand why this is urgently important, and everybody in this room and everybody out there in virtual space, to make sure that Danny's team has the support they need to get the job done. you guys have to call, you guys know people, right? I once complained to a partner that I worked for that tax was an old boys network, and he said, you know a lot of old boys. And I said, that is true, and you do too. So I want all of you to make sure that you lean on everybody you can, everybody you know, to make sure this gets done. You and the people in this room can make this happen. You could also let it not happen, but I hope that you will make it happen. So.
Well, first of all, I stand corrected, and thank you for the correction on that front. But on the second front, I don't want you to purely rely on just the goodwill of people in this room. Let's rely on their financial interests, because when the chair of the Finance Committee is writing letters to Treasury saying, I want more inclusive data, and this is how we're going to do oversight on tax expenditures, which I have the letter in citation if you'd like to see it, this is an expectation of policymakers going forward. And I think that once an effective messenger in either the House or the Senate can effectively communicate, not unlike Dorothy Brown on The View, but how the tax system has disparate impacts in terms of race or gender. And that hasn't happened yet because they haven't figured out how to message it properly. Messaging tax is hard. But once they do it, it's a policy imperative, and it's going to have impacts on our tax system and decisions that are made about our tax system and tax expenditure oversight. Because if, for example, and this is just a hypothetical, if you could show that a particular business tax expenditure benefited only one demographic group by 99%, and that group just happened to be white or just happened to be male, that doesn't necessarily, from a constitutional perspective, raise issues, but it sure does at the ballot box.
Well, do you want to know what that provision is?
I would love to know what that provision is.
So Emily Satterthwaite, a new professor at Georgetown, S corporation status. Who would have thunk? S corporation status, she showed by doing her own, she doesn't have the data, but she's smart and creative, and she did the number crunching on her own to figure out that S corporation status, for some reason, nobody knows why, is overwhelmingly used by white taxpayers, controlling for everything else. Absurd, and I'm sure that is once all the data is resolved and analyzed, that's going to be the silliest example and probably the least compelling, but she stumbled upon it in her research. It wasn't what she was looking for, but she found it and she published it, and we now know that just by happenstance that the S corporation really is something that is racially disparate.
And so when that narrative begins to be embraced by more than just the Emilys and the Dorothys and the Stevens and the Carolines of the world in just the academic space, but becomes more generally accessible, you're gonna see change. And I know this because I worked on Capitol Hill, and I have never met a politician that doesn't want to be responsive to their constituents. That's just kind of how they work. And so there's that perspective, but it hasn't happened yet. And this brings us to Mark. Can you kind of give us an institutional framework for why this hasn't happened yet, or just based on your experience, 27 years?
So just a couple of things. One, there is a ton of institutional pushback on this, kind of across the board. And part of it is just, it's never been done that way. And so change is hard. And so as Danny pointed out, with the work that's being done by Treasury and Census, they had to change the way that they were dealing with the business, set up a contract, which takes some amount of time, and then go through a lot of legal work to make this happen. And I think people had in their heads that there's this giant spreadsheet.
Oh, I think some of the audience can't quite hear. Could we turn up his mic a little bit? Okay. Oh, we're bringing him a new one. Okay. We're bringing him a super, no, they're bringing you a super powered mic.
Thank you.
Maybe that was part of the institutional resistance, I don't know.
Is this better? Okay, great. So part of the change here is just that you have to change the way things have been done for many, many years, and that is just hard for people to get their heads around. And I think some folks believe that there was this giant spreadsheet in the federal government somewhere, and all you needed to do was put the right Excel commands in, and you'd get this data out by whatever racial or ethnic or gender background that you wanted. And that does not exist. And so you need to create the data sets in order to do that, which have both technical challenges and conceptual challenges. On the technical challenge side, Danny pointed out a little bit about just the work that has to be done to match these data up. But even in kind of like a micro area, a tax unit is not the same as a household for census purposes, not the same as a family for other purposes. And so just trying to figure out how you make those links is a challenge. Second, the data that gets collected is of uneven quality, especially if you look at a time series. If you think of the way the census used to be collected, an enumerator came out to your house and wrote down your characteristics. So those data probably have some biases from the enumerators in there. That makes time series hard. If you go to now, many people self-assess. That puts a different set of challenges in place with the data. And so it's going to take a lot of research work to figure out how to make these linkages and how to make the conclusions make sense. What are the types of precision that's around these estimates and so on. So as part of what I want to do is like tamp down expectations a little bit that this is a long project. And as Danny pointed out, within 5 years, we hope to have some big advantages or big advances, but they're not going to happen overnight, and that's one thing. Second, as Caroline points out, the demand for oversight from Congress is going to be important in order to drive this, because that can be a way that you move the needle a little bit faster. Probably could go the other direction as well, depending on who's in charge in the Congress. But that's going to be important in the oversight side to say, here's what's being done and here's what's being done correctly. Third, the push from outside researchers is important. I think that the points that Stephen and Caroline made about various authors pointing to things and making advances does help move the ball a little bit. And that's important because, again, in government, there's not like an unlimited number of resources to do this work. The Biden administration made it a top priority, but that went from being almost no priority to one of many high priorities. And so that's a big step forward, but it doesn't, by itself, constitute a sufficient set of actions.
I appreciate the reality check, because I'm overly ambitious in what I think we can accomplish in the next 2 years. And
one other thing, Caroline, just to keep in mind, the privacy that's associated with this data is important.
I'm getting to that.
Okay.
I want to know, because there are the technical challenges, which you point out, and which I'm willing to overlook that and your concerns about that, because in my view, we didn't used to do heart transplants, but we've somehow figured out a way to do that. And necessity will drive innovation on that front. And a number of law professors, including Jeremy Bear-Friend, who details in his article all the different approaches that have been done using existing data sets as approximations, which may not be good enough for economist purists like yourselves, but for lawyers like me, we're like, good enough. It's a rough approximation that can tell a larger story, and the inequities are what they are. There's this overwhelming concern, which Biden points out every single time he talks about this issue, which is taxpayer privacy concerns. And so if you could talk a little bit about that, and if, Stephen, if you have comments on that.
So it's both taxpayer privacy and census privacy.
Okay.
So one of the points that Danny was making, the reason census can't just give the IRS or Treasury the data is because, by law, census can't do that. They can take data from Treasury or HUD or someone and then put it together with their data and then release it in statistical form in a way that's not identifiable. Similarly, on the tax side, there are strong prohibitions about releasing tax data. And we've seen the ProPublica story that's come out, which has made it more difficult for our tax researchers to have access to the data to do the work that they normally do. So there are those challenges as well. And there's an expectation, I think, from people that their data are private. And then from the technical side, one of the things that you need to look at is to ensure that the release of data doesn't allow you to identify particular taxpayers or individuals or households. Which means that you're probably not going to get the detail that you want, whether it's geographic detail or ethnic group detail or other types of breakdowns, just because the cells will be too small. And so there's just a bunch of complications here, which are new research projects that are being undertaken now.
Do you follow thoughts?
Sure. Everything Mark says, you won't be surprised to learn, is totally true. But I also want to echo what Caroline has said, that we don't want to let the perfect be the enemy of the good here. And the fact that Emily Satterthwaite, this is back when she was at Toronto, just stumbles upon this fact about S corporation status really tells us all we need to know. I don't think she had access to any private data. This is just information she's able to put together, with her, junior professor at a random university in Canada about us. I hear what Mark is saying, and I think that's true. I also have spoken with folks like Tracy Gordon at Tax Policy Center about the work they're doing. And this is what Danny said, but maybe people in the room didn't understand it. So there are micro simulation models that Tax Policy Center uses to tell you what is good or bad about these different tax policies. But they don't have access to race data because the IRS doesn't have it. There are ways to link those the micro simulation studies to the CPS, the current population survey from Treasury, from Census. And you can do that in a way that makes the data synthetic, right? So you can create, and I love that this is true. I have no idea what it means, but I've been told by smart people it's true. You can create synthetic tax data that doesn't tell you anything about any actual people, but tells you everything you need to know about the population. And if you can do this, there's literally no risk to anybody knowing anything about any particular taxpayer. So, you can do it in the fast and loose way that Emily Satterthwaite did, and Dorothy Brown has done, in her office at Emory and everywhere else she's been over the years, just doing this with a hammer and tongs method. Or you can do the super slick method that I know Danny is working on and that Tax Policy Center is working on that will completely obviate any privacy concerns. You don't have to believe me. You can believe smart people like Tracy Gordon, who assured me this is true, and I have no reason to doubt her.
Oh, and Jeremy Friend listed them all out, and that's what this slide is various approaches that have been done to approximate with.
Beverly Moran has done this in '96,
yeah.
Right? So this is not new.
Yeah, I mean, there are ways to approximate, but I think this is also part of the challenge of lawyers talking to economists, right? And that is a really big challenge that we have in this space, that I see it as a researcher, because I do research on gender and small business tax expenditures. And I've talked to JCT, I've talked to different folks on the Hill about these issues, and it's different coming from being a lawyer versus being an economist. And I think that step one is to have better collaboration between the two disciplines in moving forward with these conversations. Because as an earlier slide, which we glanced over, but is worth pointing out again, there might not be constitutional constraints, but there are certainly equitable constraints that guide conversations around inequities in the tax code. And what I've seen in my experience that I pointed out earlier is going to be a guiding point for policymakers going forward. But more than that, I wanted to follow up on one piece, which is, Stephen, what do you think, and based on what you've written, what are the implications of the absence of this data? What do you think why does it matter, and what's going to drive the changes? Because we don't have this data, taxpayers don't expect it, and yet we do have a voluntary system, right? The system doesn't work if you don't voluntarily participate in it.
So it's a great question, and in a way this is the dog that did not bark, right? The question is, what happens when you don't have information? The short answer is inaction, right? As you say, Congress responds to its constituents, and if none of its constituents have any idea that there's a problem, they have actual problems that they know about, right? They're putting out fires constantly, and if somebody says, I think there might be a fire here, but I really can't show anything, if they don't have the data to prove it, or even to demonstrate it, again, folks like Beverly Moran have been doing this for decades, Dorothy Brown's been doing it for decades, Jeremy Friend, he looks about 13 years old. He's older than my son, but he looks about the same age. So he hasn't been doing it that long, but he's been very effective and persuasive in his arguments here. this is important, needs to be done. And I think that, as you say, are we going to know with perfect clarity what is happening here? I'll give you an example. So another case, Havens Realty versus Coleman. This is I think a 1980 case. I'm not sure what it's from, but it was a Richmond civil rights organization sent black and white testers to answer an ad for real estate. And you won't be surprised to learn that the black woman told there were no vacancies, while the white woman told there were several apartments available. And this went up to the Supreme Court. The question was, could these testers bring this litigation because they weren't really harmed, because they didn't really plan to live in the apartment? Right? The Supreme Court said they could do that. So I know we're talking about tax data here, and we're looking for really great tax data that economists would love. But there are a lot of ways to get the information and to make this point in a compelling way. I think tax data is a really great way to do it. I'm a nerd. Most people in this room are nerds, so we understand data. But it's only one way to do this. But I do think that the stakes are very high, because if the information is not made available, there won't be any action. And I think that that is, to me, the very scary prospect that if we don't do anything in the next year, the election will have started, and then we'll do nothing ever. If it doesn't happen the next year, and if we don't get the report the next year, I don't think it'll ever happen. And that is really depressing to me. And I think those are the stakes here.
Danny's like, wait up, hold on.
Listen, I may be a little cynical, and I'm wearing this t-shirt, I'm a little radicalized, so maybe that's my perspective. But I do think that this is a now issue. If it doesn't happen now, I don't see it ever happening.
What do you think, Danny?
I was actually going to take it local instead of federal, tying together your disparate impacts slide here with what happens when we don't have the data. Property taxes. We have hundreds of years of experience paying property taxes. The rules are the rules. Doesn't seem like there's any differential impact by race and ethnicity in that. How could there be? Two former Berkeley students, had the privilege of advising them, Howard Troop and Carlos Avenancio Leon, took public data, because housing is special, property taxes are special, there's a lot more public data out there, merged race and where you lived in Chicago and other cities, and found that black families paid higher property taxes than white families in equivalently valuable homes. So think about that. That would be the equivalent of a black family paying higher income tax than a white family with the same income. How is that possible? It's possible through two mechanisms that now these cities, now that they have the data and are seeing the impacts, are figuring out how to overcome. The first is that the assessments. In between transactions of a house, how should you update the property taxes? Well, you have a formula. It turns out that in Chicago, if your formula is not very targeted to the local neighborhood, you're going to overestimate the appreciation of the house value in predominantly black neighborhoods in Chicago relative to white ones. So the default assessment is too high on average for black families than for white families. And then second, there's an appeals process. White families are more likely to appeal. Conditional on appealing are more likely to win a reduction in their property tax bill. Those two areas, everything facially race neutral, but having a disparate impact across racial groups. And in talking with members of the city of Chicago who are kind of running the formula, there are ways forward. Zillow has a formula that's actually quite neighborhood specific. And cities can actually update these formulas now that they know what's happening. You only are going to do that once you know what's happening.
Can I just add? So I just, I was communicating with Jim Alm. I don't know, a lot of folks in this room probably know him. He's writing along with two co-authors a new article, and I know the title is a shout out to Dorothy Brown, Race, Ethnicity, and Taxation of the Family, the Many Shades of the Marriage Tax Subsidy. And he's showing, or they're showing in this paper that isn't out yet, but keep an eye out for it, that So example, looking at the abstract now, black couples nearly always pay more in income taxes than white couples with similar family income, largely because black married women are more likely to work than white married women, and also because the incomes of black couples tend to be more evenly split between spouses than the incomes of white couples. So again, he's doing the micro simulation plus census data, duct tape, sort of MacGyver style tax data research, but that's what they're seeing. So what Danny's saying is an incredibly compelling example, but others are doing the same work, and so hopefully we'll get more.
So I think it's incredibly important to also bring in the business tax expenditures. And this is what I do my work on. I focus on women business owners and the small business tax expenditures and their uptake, whether or not, because I worked on the Senate Small Business Committee, I've worked with plenty of policymakers that authorize these tax expenditures to give small businesses access to capital. And the questions that I looked at were, do women have access to capital? Women who we have decades of economic data show have a harder challenge accessing capital, and for women of color, it's even doubly more challenging. And so while the property tax and the joint filing issues are documented and exist, I don't want to ignore the business tax expenditures as being an area where there could possibly be inequity. And so I wanted to ask Danny, you, of what you guys are looking at on the business tax expenditure front, and then I wanted to follow up with you, Mark, as to what you think is actually realistic on that front.
The case study that we're working on is the CARES Act economic impact payments one, and as Mark said, it takes a new contract, and we're working through that. I actually think that, Caroline, I too have a soft spot in my heart for business tax research. And when one looks at the data that are regularly transferred to census, it skews individual.
Okay.
And that's going to, characterize the types of research that are kind of off the shelf possible.
Okay.
I do think that a next step is to say, okay, the circle of tax data that under statute census needs in order to produce economic measurements, are there more business returns that are necessary and useful there? And I think yes.
So that's true, but when we think about the world of Schedule C filers, right, like that's still an individual return, which I would hope, and yes. when I look at women business owners, they are predominantly Schedule C filers making less than $100,000 in revenue, so I would hope that there would be a little something there.
That's there.
And this comes to mind particularly when we think about new additions to the code, like Section 199 Cap A, and JCT put out some estimates around the distribution, not with gender or any other demographic data, but JCT put out in 2018, was it? The distribution. Of course I have a slide on it. I just threw it together just because I thought that might come in handy. Oh, there it is. There it is. The distribution of 199 Cap A. So I did want to ask a little bit about what you think about business tax expenditures, because this is a huge part of the code, and this is a huge cost to the code.
So a couple of things on business tax expenditures. One, I think it's important to distinguish between corporate taxpayers and flow-through taxpayers.
Okay.
And 199A flow-through taxpayers obviously skewed to the top of the income distribution, as probably 179 deductions are as well. And so if you were to just think of doing a simple correlation of income and gender, almost for sure you'd see males benefiting more than females from those on the flow-through side. On the corporate side, I think it's different. And part of the difference is to think about what the baseline is here for a change. The corporate income tax is very progressive, very much on capital owners. Every one of the individual provisions might not be so progressive, right? And so really you want to think about the whole baseline versus individual provisions. And so what Danny's talking about doing for the EIP program, it's one individual provision, but that doesn't tell you about the entire system as a whole. It tells you about one thing. And part of what I think you want to do is be careful about which of those you're talking about, whether the entire system is inequitable or unfair, or a particular provision has some aspects that are unfair or inequitable.
And I think that that makes sense, right? And what I think that the larger picture, based on my experience, and I'd like to know what you think on yours, is that there has been an absence of expenditure oversight generally, right? Like, let's just spend through the code and, you know, make constituents happy, which policymakers need to do. But that absence of, you know, expenditure oversight, I think, is part of the problem that has delayed going after this kind of analysis up until this point.
I think it's exactly right.
Yeah. But what's interesting is that, did you see the slide that had the Marty Sullivan quote about how President Biden, who never sat on the tax writing committees, actually introduced legislation that would sunset tax expenditures and take them out of the jurisdiction of the tax writing committees? And I think that that's different. I think having a president that understands what an expenditure is and how that it is, in fact, spending through the tax code, regardless of whether or not, you know, the Supreme Court has ruled that it's an official, you know, programmatic spending that's subject to non-discrimination testing, I think changes the urgency around these issues. But the last question that I wanted to ask each of our panelists, because we are bumping up against time and you guys have been so wonderful and patient sitting through this, is I know what I think normalizing expectations around inclusive data, tax data, will do for the policymaking purposes, but I want to know what you all think normalizing these expectations will do. And Danny, I have a feeling you're going to be like, lower your expectations.
Let me start with Mark, who will start us off there.
Okay.
Yeah, I think lower expectations is probably a good place to go.
Exactly.
That right now you have about no information on this and very little reliable information. And part of what you want to do is begin to create a culture where that information gets put out regularly.
I'm on it.
So just like the income breakdowns, you want something where it's regular. And then you can expect policymakers to look at it and use it as part of the inputs to making policy. But you need that data before you can, I think, leap ahead.
All right, what do you think, Stephen?
I think that it's a complicated question. I think one of the reasons you might manage expectations, so tax expenditure analysis itself tells us what this is, you know, likely to do or not do, right? So I think that when Surrey created this, his vision, my own personal view of his vision was that he thought he's going to create this tax expenditure analysis. Everybody's going to see that, you know, this is just spending through the code, and nobody's going to do it anymore because they'll see this will be revealed to be spending, and that totally didn't work. Everybody's like, oh wait, you're kidding? There's a way to spend through the code? Let's go do it. So I'm not sure that people are going to find that there are great ways to be racist through the code, but I do think that we have to understand that it's not going to necessarily play out in the way that we expect it to. But I think it's important to have this information. I personally don't really, I hope that this shows that the code is incredibly racially progressive and that we've been worrying about nothing for years. To me, that would be a great outcome. I don't expect that to happen. But I do think that knowing the answer will be valuable even if it doesn't play out exactly the way that, you know, Dorothy Brown imagines or Jeremy. That's fine. I think we need to know the information, and whatever happens, I think, is what should happen.
Danny?
I think the challenge and the opportunity tie together what Stephen and Mark were saying, which is it's hard to go from a variable in one data set merged to another data set that has different units. Like the units are defined differently, family versus tax unit versus household versus individual. The opportunity is that when you work through it and you don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, you validate what you're doing by saying, you know what, in this merged data set, we reproduce this number that we know to be true from this other place. We validate our procedure. We are very, very close. And now we're using that procedure to produce this new table, this new version of, you know, the JCT distribution of 199A or whatever. And once you do that and you validate, you show it's possible, then we have a new standard of, you know, this is doable, we can do it, let's do it more.
Well, on that, I just want to thank all of you for taking time to join us today, and particularly Julie. You were the driving force behind this roundtable, and thank you so much for your tireless work to bring us all together and to give us the opportunity to talk about this. And just thank you so much for having us.
Huge, huge thanks to everybody. And I do want to say, you know, to me, one of the reasons I'm passionate about this issue is it's not only like that these tax policies impact everybody, but tax policies determine different motivations for people. And, you know, I got into it on the gender side and looking at other countries, and somebody mentioned the marriage penalty. And, you know, other countries who want to get women in the workforce, look at that, change it. You know, and so our tax system, as you all know, that's part of the reason you're sitting here, hugely impactful. So it's just super important. Each of you were just amazing. So thank you so much. And each of you were just amazing, sitting so, you know, as rapt as I was about this statistical, this panel on data analysis. But so I'm not going to keep you any longer. I'm just going to say, please come in the fall in Dallas. We've seen how great it is to be back together October 13th through 15th. And thank you for everybody for hanging in there and for showing up now.